1 year ago, I released one of my biggest and most important films yet, King Kong vs. Prometheus. It was quite a journey to bring this lost project back from the grave, full of challenges, hardships, and new discoveries, but it was a journey that I was proud to be a part of. From the film's amazing backstory, to the constant doubt I faced, to the new techniques I tried out, every part of this project has a story that needs to be heard.
What's up everyone, my name is Mikhail Trench, director and writer of Kong vs. Prometheus, and I'm here to tell you those stories. So just sit back and relax as I tell you the story of how I brought back the beast.
In March of 1933, the world was introduced to one of the most important films ever made, King Kong. In case you're not familiar with the tale, the film focuses on a movie director named Carl Denham who plans to make a new big film on an uncharted island. Bringing along with him a young actress named Ann Darrow, the crew make their way to the island, which turns out to be a land where prehistoric creatures run amok. The ruler of the island, a giant ape named Kong, takes Anne after the island's natives kidnap her and continues to protect her from the various beasts throughout the film. Later on, the crew captures Kong, takes him from the island, and puts him on display in New York, where the giant ape breaks free, kidnaps Anne again, and has an epic finale on the top of the Empire State Building. To say the least, King Kong was a huge game changer for the film industry, forever changing the way we think of sound design, storytelling, and, most significantly, special effects.
Those effects wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for one man, the one and only stop-motion pioneer himself, Willis O'Brien.
A talented cartoonist, sculptor, and wrestler, O'Brien is responsible for bringing stop-motion animation to fame in the United States in a period of time when it was mostly popular in Europe. He started off by making several short animated comedies during the 1910s, but would get his big break in feature-length films with the 1925 adaptation of the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle novel The Lost World. Here, O'Brien brought a host of dinosaurs and prehistoric creatures to life using stop motion, while also using never-before-seen techniques to combine it with live action. The world was stunned by O'Brien's work on the film, and led him to be called up again to work on a similar dinosaur feature called Creation. While working on Creation, O'Brien created new techniques to combine stop motion with live action that upped the complexity of the craft. However, the project was soon scrapped by RKO studio head David Selznick and studio producer Marion C. Cooper for financial and creative reasons. Cooper at the time was working on a story that he entitled Giant Terror Gorilla, and found O'Brien's techniques to be just what he needed to visualize his movie. O'Brien agreed to help Cooper on the project, which would eventually be renamed King Kong.
With the critical and financial success that King Kong was, not to mention its huge effect on the special effects industry, you would think that Willis O'Brien would have been a hot commodity at the time. Well...
After Kong, Willis O'Brien did find success for some time, working on the stop-motion effects for two more giant ape films, the 1933 sequel to King Kong, Son of Kong, and the 1949 Mighty Joe Young, which won him an Oscar for Best Visual Effects in 1950. But afterwards, things began to slow down. During the 1950s and 1960s, O'Brien struggled to get many planned projects off the ground, with just about all of them failing to do so, and he was stuck doing effects work for mostly B-movies at the time, such as The Giant Behemoth and Black Scorpion. Personal and financial problems were riddling the artist's life, and in an effort to turn things around, O'Brien turned back to the giant ape that made him famous again. Quickly, O'Brien thought of many story ideas he could use featuring King Kong, and ultimately came up with a concept of King Kong doing battle with one of Frankenstein's monsters. He drew out some concept art and a screenplay treatment of the film, and tried selling it off to potential producers. Most of the people he sold it to, however, were uninterested, as the price of doing a film using stop motion was just too costly at the time. Things seemed hopeless for the project until O'Brien met a producer named John Beck, who liked the story and promised to O'Brien that he would find a studio willing to make it.
Now here's when things get dirty.
After altering some story elements and changing the title from King Kong vs. Ginkgo, which had already been changed from King Kong vs. Frankenstein, to King Kong vs. Prometheus, Beck gave the script to an overseas studio that was well known for making monster movies at the time. That studio was none other than Toho, the company behind some of the most popular Japanese giant monster and sci-fi films at the time, including Rodan, Mothra, the Mysterians, and, of course, Godzilla. At the time, Toho was running out of steam, having not released a single Godzilla film since the 1955 sequel Godzilla Raids Again, and releasing a host of follow-up sci-fi films that found some success, but nowhere as impressive as the Godzilla films. After receiving the script for Kong vs. Prometheus, the folks at Toho thought it would be a great idea to make this movie, as many of the makers of Godzilla were highly influenced by the original Kong to get into special effects work and monster movies. So after replacing the Frankenstein monster with their own Godzilla, Toho released their 1962 crossover, King Kong vs. Godzilla.
Now the saddest part about this all was that the entire time that Toho had the script and were in production of Kong vs. Godzilla, Willis O'Brien was completely unaware of what had happened to his story.
Heartbroken by the backstabbing Beck and disgusted by the final product, O'Brien went into a depression, drinking heavily. Shortly after doing some minor work in the 1963 film It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, Willis O'Brien passed away on November 8, 1962, at the age of 76.
Now fortunately, Willis O'Brien's memory has not been in vain. Special effects and animation awards have been given to this man all over the map in his honor, and animators and special effects artists everywhere have pointed to him and his work on King Kong out as a source as why they went into making movies.
And little would anyone know, one of those people would hear about this failed Kong vs. Prometheus project and take the step in bringing back the Beast. Ever since I was in 7th grade, I loved making movies. I worked with both live action and stop motion to make short films, videos, and comedies with my friends, and I really loved it. Even if a lot of my earlier films were really bad, there was always a sense of fun working on them. At the time, it was really a hobby, and I didn't think that filmmaking would be the path I would want to go down in the future.
But then high school came along and changed all that mess.
From about 9th to early 11th grade, I wanted to become more serious with movie making as a hobby, particularly with stop motion, trying to improve upon the way I made sets and shot things. But these early films of mine were still not really anything I was completely proud of most of the time. It wasn't until February of 2015 that I made what I consider to be my first real film of Cat and Creature. The short was an idea I came up with after creating a clay cat with a huge mustache and doing an animation test of it. And the film was about a cat scientist who must fight off a deadly creature that escapes from its laboratory. The film was far from perfect looking back, but it was a huge step up from my previous work, using more professional techniques in the way I shot it, animated it, and generally told the story. It was a pretty big success also, at least as far as my work was concerned, getting tons of praise and even playing in a few film festivals over that summer.
With the success that of Cat and Creature was, I immediately knew what my next film was going to be.
The original King Kong was, and still is, my favorite film of all time, as it was the movie that actually got me interested in being creative and trying to make movies in the first place. For years, I was in love with its special effects, and found Willis O'Brien to be a major influence over the years as time would go on. As a fan of both him, as well as the Godzilla franchise, it was only a matter of time before I found out about King Kong vs. Prometheus, and the idea was one I found to be wildly captivating.
And besides, I don't completely blame O'Brien for hating on Kong vs. Godzilla. I mean, when you created something as cool as this... and it becomes this. Well, I can kind of see where anger's coming from.
Starting during my late freshman and early sophomore years, I began developing the idea. My version of the story, however, was almost completely different from O'Brien's draft. The original O'Brien idea was about Victor Frankenstein's grandson, who would be stationed in South Africa during the film, and his creation of a new Frankenstein monster created from the body parts of different dead animals. Meanwhile, another expedition by a different party discovers Kong and brings the behemoth back to San Francisco. The Frankenstein monster would then kill his creator and somehow end up in San Fran as well, where he and Kong would have had their fantastic battle.
Now, as much as I do love Willis O'Brien and a lot of his cool-sounding unmade projects, I did feel I could improve the story a bit and also change some things up for financial reasons as well.
My original draft took place in the 1950s and told the story of Dr. Gordon Frankenstein, the son of Victor Frankenstein, and his ventures into bringing the dead body of King Kong to life and making him a stronger, more powerful monster by using a newly built revival machine. However, the machine is unexpectedly powered by a bolt of lightning one night during a storm, and Kong escapes his captivity. To make things worse, the giant ape abducts the girlfriend of Dr. Gordon Frankenstein's assistant, Brian Peters, and in a desperate attempt to stop the massive creature, Dr. Gordon and Brian must work on bringing to life a new monster that Dr. Gordon Frankenstein had been working on for a long time, who he calls Prometheus. From there, the two monsters duke it out on the streets of San Francisco as Brian finds out that Dr. Gordon was a Frankenstein this whole time and the reasons why he needed to hide his identity. In one sequence, just before the big battle, Brian is asked by Dr. Gordon to kill him, as he is guilty for the crimes he has done against God.
Now, as you could probably tell, the biggest thing I had to cut out from my version of Kong vs. Prometheus was the inclusion of Dr. Gordon Frankenstein. However, I had reasons for doing this, despite the fact that it was kind of sad for me, given that I think he was my best written character yet.
Before production started, I had the models for all the characters, including Dr. Gordon Frankenstein, built and planned out the shoots I would do. My plan was after shooting all the sequences with the monsters, I would shoot the human scenes, and for a while, things were moving smoothly, until I got to one sequence.
And that scene may actually surprise you.
The dinner scene with Brian and Anna was actually the hardest scene I had to ever animate for this film. On top of the set pieces constantly tipping over, not balancing and moving around, which you can probably see from the film itself, it was also a challenge for me to try and work with the lip-syncing technique, as this was a completely new skill I had never used in full with any of my previous movies. Trying to control long scenes of dialogue became grueling and tiring, and considering the fact that Dr. Gordon had many big monologues written, and I was already kinda in production for longer than I was hoping, I had to halt for a little while to do some major rewrites. Now Brian would be the Frankenstein character, and there would be no assistant. It was quite sad to cut out this character, especially since all his dialogue had already been recorded and his model had already been made.
Now, in all honesty, even though I do like the idea of Dr. Gordon Frankenstein as a character, I don't know how his inclusion in the film would have really affected things. True, like I said, he was a very well-written character, but at the same time, he did have a lot of big monologues written for him that could have ultimately affected the film's pacing. I do kind of like how now the film is much more of a show-don't-tell type of experience.
However, Dr. Gordon Frankenstein's model does have some existing animation. I featured the model I used for his character in a small, non-speaking role in a film I never got around to finishing called Little Monsters, shown here for the first time. You can kind of get an idea from seeing this footage about the way his character would have moved, and maybe even the way that he could have talked given his large, cartoony mustache.
Now, other than cutting out scenes, it was actually the certain elements I actually kept from the original O'Brien story that were probably the most challenging, namely the titular characters themselves.
Trying to figure out how I would design and animate both Kong and Prometheus provided me with some interesting challenges. Kong was a bit easier to do, but since his model was the one I handled most during the film, I did have to make sure that he was durable enough to withstand the constant handling throughout production. This was kind of challenging, and it shows throughout the film, as you can see Kong's appearance getting more and more slouched as the scenes went on. This also came from the way I tried animating him, as I did my best to replicate his more ape-like movements from the original film.
To say the least, it didn't really work out, but hey, gotta give a brother points for trying.
Prometheus provided an even bigger challenge for me. Despite being in the film considerably less than Kong, I still wanted to make sure that he had a memorable looking appearance and was animated in a unique way. In the original concept art by O'Brien, Prometheus looked rather awesome, but always looked a bit too human or ape-like to me. Considering the fact that he was described as being a combination of different dead animal parts, I figured that I should emphasize those animalistic and predatory features of his design. I went through many kind of weird and quirky concept designs before I finally settled on giving him a humanoid body and torso with sharp teeth, a crocodile tail, and, to make him look a little more cool, some Wolverine-looking claws sticking out of both of his hands.
And these are what remains of Kong and Prometheus. Starting with Kong, you can see his whole body is gone, it's just the head. Basically, after filming occurred, Kong's body was in such bad shape, and I just didn't have the time or the money to really fix him up. So I just had to take off all the body, take his armature out, and I kept the head. And yeah, but the head's still in pretty good shape for the most part. And then going on to Prometheus, he's been a bit sturdier. That probably because he hasn't been used in the film as much. But you can see he's still in pretty bad shape. His body stayed intact for the most part for a really long time. But it was only until recently, like a couple months ago, that he started tearing apart. And it's pretty crazy. But that really kind of comes from bad armatures and stuff like that, and you can see his hands falling off, and here's his head. So yeah, it really shows how a long way good armatures and stuff like that can go when you're building stop motion puppets.
One new technique I wanted to try out with this film was also the use of voice acting. Before, my films never really had any dialogue. Sometimes characters would make noises which were provided by myself, such as in Of Cat and Creature, but these really didn't count as dialogue. Originally, I did plan for Kong vs. Prometheus to be half live action and half stop motion, with the monsters being shot in stop motion and on stop motion sets, and the human characters in live action. However, I was having trouble securing actors who would work with me on the project, and since my stop motion skills were getting better, I ultimately decided to make the entire film in stop motion, as a way of kind of challenging myself. This was also a nice way for me to have to cut down on finding actors, as I decided to voice all the male characters myself, including Brian Frankenstein.
Man, they're headed towards the city. We better follow them.
Malcolm Stevens the waiter,
Oh, yes indeed, ma'am.
and the black kid.
Well, your girl fine as hell. Ooh, my kidney.
However, voice acting was only the first step. I then had to tediously add those voices to the characters and make sure that their lip and body movements were synced up to what they were saying. I wasn't being very fancy with the way I did this. Most of the time, I recorded all the voices before I animated, and then while I would be animating, I played each voice track to time just when a character needed to move his mouth or body.
And I can't even describe to you guys just how tedious this was for me. I was shooting the film at about 12 frames per second, which is actually half the frames per second they use in actual stop motion movies. Now, if I was shooting a character who was going to be talking for 3 seconds, that would actually mean I'd have to shoot 36 frames just to have them say their entire sentence and get all their words out. Now, this may seem simple for some scenes, but for other scenes where characters such as the black kid have long parts of dialogue, then I would have to be working for a long time, and it was crazy tedious, guys.
However, probably the biggest challenge of Kong vs. Prometheus for me wasn't the animating or the voice acting or editing or anything like that. In actuality, the most challenging part was the immense doubt I faced throughout production that anybody would understand the film. The film is obviously for monster movie fans, but the general public, including most of the people I knew, were very unfamiliar with the original Kong, Willis O'Brien, or anything that had to do with monster films, let alone this more obscure story of the backstory of Kong versus Godzilla. I was constantly questioning the project, constantly asking myself if people would get it, if it would be any good, if all the 5 months of production I worked on this thing would be worth it.
Fast forward 1 year later, and King Kong vs. Prometheus is my highest rated video, my most viewed video, and one of the most watched King Kong fan films on YouTube.
There are many things about this film that you may have not even realized when watching it. Kong vs. Prometheus, or at least my version, was actually meant to be kind of a bridge between the original Kong and King Kong vs. Godzilla. Think about it. The film starts off with Kong still dead from his plane battle atop the Empire State Building. He gets revived by a bolt of lightning, which acts as the reason he gets stronger with electricity in Kong vs. Godzilla. This is also shown during the battle with Prometheus, when Kong is revived by the exposed cables hanging from the building. At the end, Kong survives and swims away, and we can assume he lands on Faroe Island, where he resides in Kong vs. Godzilla. Also, the film takes place in 1955, the year after Godzilla's first attack on Tokyo, and the same time of him being buried under ice in Godzilla Raids Again, which he comes out of in Kong vs. Godzilla.
Okay, that last detail really could have happened any time after Kong's death or before King Kong vs. Godzilla, but I was kind of hoping someone would come across it at some point.
There are also some little Easter eggs that I hid throughout the film. Probably the most obvious one is during Brian and Anna's dinner scene, where the wall next to them has a board of faces that says Famous Faces of California. If you take a close look at that board, you may notice that there are some faces that don't completely add up. One of the faces is of Ed Wood, the acclaimed bad movie maker of the 1950s, who here is the Ed Wood portrayed by Johnny Depp in the 1994 Tim Burton film Ed Wood, which is my personal favorite film from the director. Speaking of Tim Burton, he's also on the wall, which is inaccurate given that Burton was born in 1958, 3 years after the events of Kong vs. Prometheus. Two other notable faces on the wall are of the 1933 King Kong and Willis O'Brien himself.
Now, it was really fun to organize this wall and hide in all those little details, but it was also really nice to just pay homage to a wonderful genius like Willis O'Brien.
Other than paying homage to other films, I also decided to hide in some details from my own movies. During the final battle, Kong crashes into a movie theater called the Golden Cinema, which has a sign that says that they're playing Of Cat and Creature and a film called Prehistoric, which was a short film idea that I had that I decided to scrap. However, probably the coolest Easter egg hidden in the film, and the one you really have to pay close attention to notice, is when Brian sees the hole Kong busted through the wall to break out. If you look really closely to the ground with all the rubble and debris, you can spot a tiny Momo from a film that I called Momo Saves Christmas, which was a 2014 short Christmas film. Dang. It is truly remarkable just what a hit King Kong vs. Prometheus has been for me in such a short amount of time. I'm serious, guys. I am beyond grateful and so happy that about the time I spent working on this film having paid off to such warm reception. Kong vs. Prometheus taught me a whole lot, and I'll carry all those lessons I learned on my future projects, all the hardships, the challenges, and the new experiences. But for me, what mostly counts is that I was able to bring the idea of one of cinema's most unsung heroes to life, to show that his legacy will never truly die. Thanks a lot for joining me on this little trip down memory lane, guys. I hope you learned a lot and maybe got a bit inspired too. Be sure to subscribe for all my latest stop-motion film work and special projects, and please follow me on Instagram at Cyclops_Studios. Thanks again, guys, and I'll be sure to see you next time.